There's a distinctive mood which settles over English literature and the cultivated elite which creates literature in the 18th century. Critics have called that mood the peace of the Augustans. Now, England, but not Europe, alas, was, if not quite at peace, no longer in a condition of civil war. That Hobbesian condition, war of all against all, in which life is nasty, brutish and short. The country was now prosperous, and it could see itself, interestingly, as the leader of Europe in commerce, in science, and in international diplomacy. Under Marlborough, the brilliant general who took Britain into mainland Europe and won battles, Britain would establish itself as a major military power. Blenheim Castle, a jewel of neoclassical architecture, would be the nation's reward to its great commander, in fact a great ancestor of Winston Churchill, as it happens. The navy was, if anything, more important than the army. And Britannia, as James Thomson's 18th century anthem put it, ruled the waves. And the second verse of this ultra-chauvinistic tribute to England's greatness in 1740 is still sung out on ceremonial occasions. And it still, to some extent, expresses a lot of what the British like to think about themselves. This is how Thomson's Rule Britannia goes, the second stanza. The nations not so blessed as thee, not so blessed as you, England, must in their turns to tyrants fall, while thou, England, shalt flourish great and free, the dread and envy of them all. Who would not be English if they had the choice? Well, that's what they thought. And of course, there's a famous refrain to Thomson's poem as it's put to music. This is how it goes as poetry. Rule Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never will be slaves. But as it's sung out, it's rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. I know that song very well. It was the regimental march of the regiment I was in the army. But in fact, it's still sung out, as I say. It's known to every school child in Britain. Now, the Hanoverian dynasty, which in fact, these were the German monarchs who are now on the throne of England, created a strong Protestant leadership at the top of society. And in literature over this period, the grand project, what in fact they were moving towards inexorably, was cultivation and civilization. And the aspiration was to match the great cultural achievements of Rome under Augustus. That's why they call themselves Augustans. And that was a golden age. And Britain wanted itself to be, as it were, moving towards a golden age as well, the golden age of England, if you like. And literature, it was felt, should be polished, it should be civilized, it should reflect the values of this great civilization which was happening around them. Old English masters, such as Chaucer and even Shakespeare, were polished into 18th century styles of correctness. Now, it's not to our taste at all. I mean, let's take one example. Who now reads John Dryden's All for Love? What he did was to improve, to polish Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Now, let me give an example of what Dryden understood by polishing, by improving, by correcting, by bringing into a kind of a new sort of mode of much more acceptable verse, the rough and barbarous, but still work of genius of Shakespeare. I'll just take one example, which is Enobarbus's description of Cleopatra sailing down the Nile, or flowing down the Nile, coming down the Nile, and how beautiful she looked at the time. It's very typical of Shakespeare, incidentally, something that Dryden wouldn't do, to give this speech to a minor character. It's one of the finest speeches in all the plays. The barge she sat in, that's Cleopatra, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person, Cleopatra, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids, with diverse coloured fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid, did. Now, it's poetry so rich that one almost salivates on hearing it. But it's also conversational and sinewy. One hears the accents of everyday speech in it, the way in which people were talking when they left the theatre. And this is how Dryden corrects that passage in his All for Love, which is his rewriting of Antony and Cleopatra. Her galley down the silver Cydnus rode, the tackling silk, the streamers waved with gold. The gentle winds were lodged in purple sails. Her nymphs like Nereids round her couch were placed, where she, another sea-born Venus, lay. She lay, and leant her cheek upon her hand, and cast a look so languishingly sweet, as if, secure of all beholders' hearts, neglecting she could take them. Boys, like Cupids, stood fanning with their painted wings the winds that played about her face. I've been very unfair to Dryden, but you'll get the point. It's cool, correct, and with the Shakespeare still ringing in our ears, anemic. Now, it gets rid of that mind-bending paradox at the end of the Shakespeare speech about the boys' fans simultaneously heating and cooling what they undid did, which Dryden clearly thought was didn't make sense. But somehow Dryden has missed the point of what Shakespeare was doing. Now, nonetheless, I mean, there were failures, but there were also huge achievements. The English Augustans loved rules. They loved order. They loved what they called decorum. And order was the greatest of the values which they aimed at. And it's no accident that the greatest dictionary, Dr. Johnson's, that we have in the English language, was produced in this century. Theirs was a time when they wanted to organise everything, put everything in its place. And architecture, after the Great Fire of London, Sir Christopher Wren was charged with rebuilding London. And he built huge structures like St. Paul's Cathedral, but it was orderly. It was a neoclassical rebuilding that he undertook, and a neoclassical revision was really what the Augustans were aiming at. Neoclassicism ruled, and this went with a chastity of design, a purity of form, and a reverence for style. Now, the theatre still enjoyed royal patronage, but it was, as I said in the last lecture, strictly licensed, and it declined, really. It was words on the page which dominated, and one literary genre on those pages dominated all others, satire. And in poetry, one form, one small component above all others rides high, the heroic couplet. Now, unlike blank verse, that mighty instrument which we saw Marlowe virtually invent all those years ago, the heroic couplet rhymes, and it's not intrinsically English. It had been picked up and brought back by the court literati from France after the Restoration in 1660. But unlike the French Alexandrine, the heroic couplet has 10, not 12 feet or syllables. Now, let me illustrate what I'm talking about, because I think the ear understands the couplet better than the eye. I'm going to take the first two lines of Samuel Johnson's poem, great satire, The Vanity of Human Wishes. This is how it goes. Let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru. Now, you'll note or hear the strong or masculine final rhyme syllable, which creates closure, view, Peru. It clangs the couplet shut. Now, there's another recurrent feature in the heroic couplet, namely the caesura, or cut, division. This creates a half-line silent pause. And half-lines, of course, take us right the way back to Beowulf, so we won't go there just at the moment. Let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru. Now, the heroic couplet lends itself to epigram and closed statements. It's not as successful with long narrative because it breaks everything down to these small line briquettes. I mean, the couplet, in fact, tends to disintegrate a long narrative, unlike blank verse. I don't think you could have written Paradise Lost in couplets. It wouldn't work. Now, in terms of diction, that's the choice of words, poetry of the 18th century is addicted to periphrasis. Now, what that means is high-sounding circumlocution. You want to talk about fish, and you don't say fish. That's a common word. They use that in the marketplace. You talk about the finny tribe. And at the same time, poetry, satire of this period is equally addicted to generalized abstraction. You'll notice, to go back to those lines of Johnson, which I quoted, the use of observation rather than observers in let observation with extensive view. It would scan as well if you said let observers with extensive view, but Johnson wanted to abstract and generalize. Now, the heroic couplet was, as Lytton Strachey later put it, the Augustans' criticism of life. It incarnated on the page, in words, their ideal of order. Now, a quality which the Augustans most valued in, as it were, writing their work, getting it out, was wit. Now, wit is a three-letter word of infinite complexity. It implies knowledge or learning in its most elegant form, or at least it does at this period. And Alexander Pope, the poet, gave a classic definition, among many others, in his treatise poem, An Essay on Criticism. And what he said was, "True wit is nature to advantage dressed," and the next line will strike you as very familiar because you've heard it, "which oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed." Yes, we think, yeah, those are my thoughts exactly, but I could never put it quite as succinctly or as brilliantly as the poet does. That's wit. He takes what we think, or she takes what we think, and makes it more polished, makes it more striking, makes it more epigrammatic. Conversely, what the Augustans most detested was dullness, which is kind of wit on its day off, the other side of wit. Alexander Pope, arguably the wittiest of them all, wrote a Miltonic-length mock epic against dullness, which he called the Dunciad, the great epic of duncery, attacking personal enemies and always labelling them for their incorrigible dullness, their lack of wit, the kind of wit which his work manifested so brilliantly. A smaller, equally effective squib on dullness was penned by John Dryden, at one period the poet laureate, and who comes immediately before Pope in the great tradition of English Augustan poets. Dryden was, for entirely personal and less than admirable reasons, very antagonistic to one of his fellow rivals, Thomas Shadwell, who was another poet laureate, as it happened, like Dryden. There was an awful lot of what was called caballing and literary feuding in this period. It's very interesting to us, and it enlivened their lives as well. And the issue between Shadwell and Dryden was essentially political. Dryden was very flexible about such things as Catholicism, and he shifted with every wind of change, producing poems for whatever party it was prudent to ally himself with. Shadwell had satirized him for his much-turned coat. He thought that Dryden, in fact, was in fact just a fair-weather friend to whoever was in power. And now it was a dangerous thing to do, because Dryden was infinitely the greater poet, and he hit back. And the context is an obscure poet of huge dullness. Richard Flecknoe had just died. No one read his work. Dryden, in his satire on Shadwell, pictures a mock coronation. Coronations, of course, were a big deal at the time of the Restoration. A mock coronation in which Shadwell is, in succession to Richard Flecknoe, created the new king of dullness, or son of Flecknoe. Mac in Scots, as you probably know, means son of. So Mac Flecknoe means the son of Flecknoe. It's very unfair, but deliciously funny. This is part of it. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. This Flecknoe found, who like Augustus, young, was called to empire and had governed long, in prose and verse, was owned without dispute through all the realms of nonsense absolute. This aged prince, now flourishing in peace, and blessed with issue of a large increase, worn out with business, did at length debate to settle the succession of the state. And pondering which of all his sons was fit to reign and wage immortal war with wit, cried, "'Tis resolved, for nature pleads that he should only rule who most resembles me. Shadwell alone my perfect image bears, mature in dullness from his tender years. Shadwell alone of all my sons is he, who stands confirmed in full stupidity. The rest to some faint meaning make pretence, but Shadwell never deviates into sense." It's all there. The appeal to classical Augustan standards, the genuflection to wit, the satirical ad hominem in that wonderful final couplet, the rest to some faint meaning make pretence, but Shadwell never deviates into sense. Now, Shadwell, as his supporters insist to this day, was by no means a bad poet, and he was a goodish playwright. He did his literary work as best he could, competently and honourably, but he will never now rise from the literary grave with Dryden's satire staked through his heart. Now, even more masterful than Dryden with the couplet and impersonal satire was Alexander Pope, who was born in 1688 and came on the scene about 20 years after Dryden. Now, Pope's background was very unusual. He was afflicted by bodily disfigurement. Enemies loved to portray him as a hunchback or a round-shouldered, dwarfish ape. And his life was, as he put it in one of his verse epistles, one long disease. He suffered. He was born and brought up Catholic, which exacerbated his sense of being on the edge of his world, able to see it and comment on it, but never quite to join it. Of course, never, to be an elegant member of society, handicapped as he was. He was educated at home. He was too frail to go to school or university. And he was very precocious and was writing exquisitely accomplished verse in his early teens. He lisped, as he said, in his cradle. Now, his life was short, but his works were long and many. And Pope's work comprises a huge corpus, including best-selling translations in couplets of Homer and Virgil, an edition of Shakespeare, and also philosophical treatises such as the Essays on Man and on Criticism, all of them in couplets. He's the master of the couplet. His works were hugely popular with an increasingly literate reading public, and Pope is often regarded with Johnson as the first purely professional writer in England. One, that is, who could live off sales, not patronage. He didn't require great rich people to help him on his way. His readers were enough. Now, it's Pope's satires which have preserved his name as arguably the greatest poet of his century, the 18th century. I've mentioned the two Dunciads, but lighter in touch, and more representative, I think, of his genius, is the mock epic, The Rape of the Lock. It was published in 1714, and it revolves around a tiny episode in English upper-class life. Mainland Europe at the time, incidentally, was in flames, but as I say, the Augustans had their peace. Now, it's hard to think of a more petty quarrel than the Rape of the Lock deals with. In a country house, Ingatestone Hall in Essex, a beau had cut a lock of hair from the head of a belle without her permission. It created a huge fuss between the respective families. Both, incidentally, were old Catholic families. Pope satirized the pettiness of the quarrel by casting the event in a mock-heroic mould with great Homeric epic machinery. But he did it so diplomatically that the satire did not wound. And in fact, the Rape of the Lock served to heal the rift between these two warring families. Now, the following is the famous description of Belinda, she whose locks will be ravished. She was called Arabella Fermor in real life, and she's preparing her morning toilette, putting on her makeup, as we would say. Now, she's a somewhat feather-brained beauty, a kind of leading figure, a leading beauty in the contemporary monde. But she's described in Pope's poem as if she were a Homeric goddess, girding herself, assisted not by maidservants, but nymphs and priestesses. And now unveiled the toilet stands displayed, each silver vase in mystic order laid. First robed in white, the nymph intent adores, with head uncovered, the cosmetic powers. A heavenly image in the glass appears, to that she bends, to that her eyes she rears. The inferior priestess at her altar's side, trembling begins the sacred rites of pride. And so it goes on, describing the objects on Belinda's dressing table. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet doux. The maids do their duty with Belinda's coiffure, the last cosmetic act before she enters the world, the morn, before showing herself off before her admirers. The busy sylphs surround their darling care. These set the head, and those divide the hair. Notice how cleverly Pope uses the caesura here, dividing the two functions with the division of the line. Some fold the sleeve, whilst others plait the gown, and Betty's praised for labours not her own. Now, underlying the apparent tribute to this paragon of beauty, there's a subversive note of criticism. It's what they called at that time bathos or clash. That's to say, something which doesn't sound quite right. Consider that line, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet-doux. Now, are such cosmetic trifles as patches, those are black beauty spots, black stickers on the face. Some say they were there to mask syphilitic sores. That's why they became fashionable. Billet-doux, which are love letters, are they of equal importance with Bibles? It's not entirely flattering, but so charmingly done, so light-handedly, that who, even Belinda, Arabella, could resent it? Now, the kind of satire and heroic couplet which Pope specialised in was called Horatian, after the Latin poet Horace, the great Augustan. Horatian satire, as I hope has been evident, is conversational and relaxed in tone. It flows effortlessly off the page. Pope was, of course, famously fluent. I mean, he seems just being able to actually turn out this elegant verse as easily as other people could actually converse. Now, there was another kind of satire, another variety of satire, popular in the period, which is called Juvenalian, after the post-Augustan poet Juvenal. It's harsher, more moralistic and angrier, though it's still very decorous. It's still within the rules which the Augustans laid down for themselves. Now, in Juvenalian satire, we hear not civilized conversation, but the voice of the preacher, talking down to the congregation. And the master of the Juvenalian genre is Samuel Johnson, and his masterpiece is called The Vanity of Human Wishes. It's an imitation, a very key word at this period, of Juvenal's 10th satire. That's to say, he's doing a Juvenal. Now, effectively, what Johnson does, following his great classical model, is to survey human greatness in all its multiple examples and show how inevitably any triumph always ends in decay and disappointment. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, saith the preacher. And so saith Dr. Johnson as well. All careers, said the English politician Enoch Powell, end badly. And so too it is with Johnson. His examples, which are multiple in the poem, display the fact or demonstrate the fact that no human achievement can, as it were, survive the corrosive blasts of time. Now, what's fascinating in this poem is how Johnson turns the satire on himself, the scholar who spent decades labouring on the first great dictionary in English. What for? Now, Samuel Johnson had worked his way through university, toiled for years, and produced his monumental work, and finally, it was dust in his mouth. Let Johnson himself speak of the hardship of being a scholar. And I think anyone who's educated, and all of us are in a sense nowadays, will feel the truth of what he's saying. When first the college rolls receive his name, that's the aspirant scholar, the young enthusiast quits his ease for fame. Resistless burns the fever of renown, caught from the strong contagion of the gown. He wants, in fact, to graduate. O'er Bodley's dome, in Oxford, his future labours spread, and Bacon's mansion trembles o'er his head. He walked round Oxford and sees the buildings in which these previous great scholars have worked. Are these thy views? Proceed, illustrious youth, and virtue guard thee to the throne of truth. Yet should thy soul indulge the generous heat till captive science yields her last retreat, if in fact you make it there, should reason guide thee with her brightest ray and pour on misty doubts resistless day, should no false kindness, these are the lists of things which actually sort of oppose scholarship, and pour on misty doubts resistless day, should no false kindness lure to loose delight, nor praise relax, nor difficulty fright, should tempting novelty thy cell refrain, your study, and sloth's bland opiates shed their fumes in vain. I love that. Sloth's bland opiates shed their fumes in vain. Should beauty blunt on fops her fatal dart, nor claim the triumph of a lettered heart, you won't have any time for sex, believe me. Should no disease thy torpid veins invade, nor melancholy's phantoms haunt thy shade, yet hope not life from grief or danger free, nor think the doom of man reversed for thee. Deign on the passing world to turn thine eyes, and pause a while from learning to be wise. There mark what ills the scholar's life assail, toil, envy, want, the patron and the jail. Originally that last line read, toil, envy, want, the garret and the jail. But Johnson had a very bad time with patrons, particularly so during his 20 years hard labour on the dictionary. And in the dictionary, Johnson exacts some small revenge by defining a patron as commonly a wretch who supports with indolence and is paid with flattery. Lord Chesterfield, whose letters on manners to his son are a minor classic of the Augustan period, haughtily refused the obscure dictionary maker help at the beginning of his project. But my Lord Chesterfield intimated, as the dictionary reached its glorious conclusion, that now that Johnson was a famous man, he, Chesterfield, might after all be minded to help with a few £100, in return, of course, for a flattering dedication in the dictionary. Now, Johnson retorted with a magnificently contemptuous refusal. "Is not a patron, my lord," he asked, "one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he's reached ground, encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labours, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent, and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary, and cannot impart it, till I am known, and do not want it." And he ends, "Your lordship's most humble, most obedient servant, Sam Johnson." And that he certainly wasn't. Now, the letter has a larger significance. The writer need truckle no more. He no longer needed patrons, those damned wretches who had oppressed literary genius for centuries. The public would henceforth support the man of letters' literary endeavours. So, is The Vanity of Human Wishes finally a depressing poem? Now, surprisingly, it isn't. Consider the passage above and the line, "Pause a while from letters to be wise." Now, letters here, of course, means literature. Now, what does being wise mean, as Johnson understands it? It means Christian stoicism, putting up with our lot. Because, in fact, a doctrine which one can find echoed in Juvenal, the original of the Vanity of Human Wishes, the original of the Vanity of Human Wishes. Life, as Johnson saw it, was a condition in which, as he said, much was to be endured and little enjoyed. But in the climax of his poem, he turns away from Juvenal's pagan nihilism to Christian acceptance. It is the divine plan, he suggests, that our great achievements in life should end in failure. And Johnson's, I think, is a message which we ourselves would do well to take to heart. However much we love literature, we should pause a while and ask ourselves, reading is good, but let us not forget also to live. Is that not good as well? And is not living well better than reading well? Johnson, I would suggest, does that most difficult of things in literature. We admire what he's doing with words. We admire what he's doing with poetry. But at the same time, we feel that enshrined in what he's doing is a truth. That is to say, why do we read literature? Well, we read literature to be entertained. We read literature, in fact, to learn things. But I think if we really honest with ourselves, if we do a kind of spiritual introspection of the kind the Puritans loved, we say that we read literature because we do hope that we will be better people for having read it. We do hope, as it were, not just to learn tricks, not just to learn how to actually sort of impress people and perhaps even to get degrees. Think of the scholar's life, the fever of renown, the strong contagion of the gown. We don't do it necessarily for that, though that in fact is one of the kind of incidental, as it were, rewards. We do it because in fact we want, as it were, to be good. We want to be better. We want, in fact, to fulfill ourselves. Now, whether or not you agree with Johnson, and not everyone will, I mean, I think probably there is a slight sort of, as it were, sort of temperamental melancholy or depression in his view of life. Nonetheless, it seems to me that his great poem does, if taken on board in the spirit in which he means, in the spirit in which he intends us to take it on board, it does, in fact, make us, or at least I speak for myself, hope that we are a better person. It's great poetry.